If you want to see how I turned power against the Kerren and delivered justice in a way she never saw coming, make sure you subscribe right now, because this is a story you do not want to miss. The sun had barely risen, and the air was thick with the smell of wet soil and freshly cut grass. I stood at the edge of the ditch that ran across the front of my ranch, listening to the rush of water as it cut its steady path downhill. The water glimmered in the soft morning light, while scattered papers lay damp against the mud. They were the latest threats from the HOA. Each letter screamed of fines, lawsuits, and ultimatums. My fingers tightened as I picked one up, feeling the weight of arrogance in every printed line. This land had been my pride for years. Every fence post I hammered by hand, every patch of soil I turned with sweat and patience. The ditch was not just some channel carved into dirt. It was a very lifeline that kept the ranch safe. Without it, rainstorms would drown the pasture and flood the barn. Without it, I would lose animals and possibly my livelihood. The ditch was not for decoration. It was necessity carved by both law and nature. But none of that mattered to the HOA. In their eyes, the ditch was an eyesore, a scar upon their perfect vision of manicured lawns and polished driveways. They called it unsightly. They called it a violation. They demanded it be filled and replaced with uniform turf, as though my ranch was just another square of their suburban chessboard. I tried to reason with them. I wrote letters, I attended their meetings. I spoke, calmly explaining that the ditch was legally required by the city. I brought out maps and documents that proved its purpose. But each time my words were swatted away like flies. They laughed in my face during one heated gathering in the community hall. And leading the chorus of mockery was the HOA president herself. Her name was Linda, tall, sharp, and always dressed as though she were attending a business gala. Her eyes carried the cold sheen of superiority. She lived for control and for the applause of those who feared her authority. Linda looked at me with the kind of smile that dripped venom, yet never lost its polish. In that meeting, she stood tall before everyone and declared that no rancher, no matter how stubborn, would stand in the way of neighborhood uniformity. I remember the sound of laughter following her words. Some neighbors chuckled, nervously afraid to appear unsupportive of her. Others looked away, unwilling to meet my eyes. And I remember the heat rising in my chest, the kind that burned slow and steady like a coal waiting for air. After the meeting, I approached her once more. I asked her if she understood what removing the ditch meant, that it would bring real harm, not just inconvenience. That water has no respect for her rules or her papers. But she only smirked and leaned closer, whispering words that would cling to me long after. You can fight us all you want, but in the end, we always win. That was the moment the lines were drawn. I walked away knowing reason had no place here. They would not stop until they either forced me to bend or broke me completely. Back at the ranch, I sat in the quiet of the barn, listening to the soft shuffled hooves on hay. My cattle breathed slow, steady breaths, their warmth a reminder of what I was protecting. I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on my shoulders. This was more than about a ditch. It was about my right to work my land and keep it safe. It was about standing against people who believed power gave them the right to destroy lives. Days passed, and the letters multiplied. Each envelope carried harsher threats than the last. Daily fines that stacked higher than my mortgage. Threats of liens that could one day take the land from me. And all the while Linda's smug face hovered in my mind. She was not simply enforcing rules. She was making an example of me. One night, I walked the length of the ditch with only the stars as witness. The water moved with patient strength, whispering over stone and soil. I crouched low, trailing my hand through the cold current. My mind echoed with her words again. In the end, we always win. But I knew something she did not. The land has its own laws written long before HOAs or boards or signatures. Water will always carve its path. And so will those who refuse to be broken. The first section of this fight had closed with their laughter ringing in my ears. But a deeper sound stirred within me. Not the sound of defeat. The sound of a storm gathering on the horizon. I tried at first to keep faith in reason. I gathered legal codes, printed out documents from the county office, and highlighted passages that showed the ditch was not just allowed, but required. I went to their office, carrying a binder thick with evidence. I placed it on their polished desk and spoke with calm, measured words. I explained how flooding would spread beyond my ranch into nearby lots if the ditch were filled. I showed photos of past storms where the water line crept high against the barn doors. They did not care. The woman at the desk glanced at my binder as though it were nothing more than a nuisance and told me the board had already decided. Each day of resistance would now cost me $200 in fines. I asked to see Linda. The receptionist smirked and said Linda was busy. Busy, I thought. Busy tightening the noose. The letters grew crueler. They arrived daily like vultures circling overhead. Red print shouted words like foreclosure and lien. Each envelope carried not just threats but an unspoken message. We own you. I would tear them open my hands, shaking with rage. Some nights I tossed them straight into the fire pit and watched the paper curl into ash. Yet the weight of those words remained heavy inside me. Linda herself seemed to enjoy the chase. She began walking past my ranch, more often her heels clicking against the pavement, her sharp perfume cutting through the air. Once she paused by the fence where I was mending a post. She called out loud enough for neighbors to hear. How long before the fines bury you? You might as well give up now. I stared at her across the fence line. The cattle shifted behind me, sensing my anger. I wanted to shout to tell her the land would outlast her arrogance, but I swallowed the words. She thrived on scenes. She wanted me to snap. I would not give her the satisfaction. Not yet. The community itself began to split. Some neighbors stopped by to quietly tell me they supported me. They admitted the ditch had always been necessary. A few even whispered that Linda had long abused her power. But when I asked if they would stand with me, publicly, their eyes fell to the ground. They were afraid of her letters, of her fines, of the way she turned the board into a weapon. Fear kept them silent. Others avoided me altogether. They crossed the street when walking dogs. They pulled curtains closed when I passed. Rumors spread that I was reckless, that I was stubborn, that I cared more about mud than the neighborhood. Linda's words slithered through the community like poison. She was not just attacking me. She was painting me as an enemy of everyone else. The breaking point came with the rain. A storm rolled in one evening, heavy and relentless. I stood at the barn doors watching sheets of water hammer the ground. The ditch filled quickly, carrying the torrent downhill, as it always had. But part of it was blocked now. I had been forced by their threats to build a temporary barrier, to make it appear less visible from the road. Water began to back up against it and spread across the pasture. I rushed into the storm, pulling at the barrier, fighting the current. The mud sucked at my boots, the rain blinded me. My cattle bellowed in fear as the water crept closer to the barn. For hours I battled the storm, dragging sandbags, hauling debris, cutting new paths with a shovel. By the time the rain eased, my body was soaked and trembling. But the ditch had survived. Barely. When the sky cleared, I stood in the ruined pasture, staring at the shallow lake that had formed. My animals were safe, but the land bore deep scars. I thought of what would have happened if I had not been there to fight. The barn would have flooded, the livestock lost, the soil ruined. And all because of their obsession with appearances. I sat on the porch long into the night clothes, clinging damp to my skin. I felt exhaustion, but beneath it something sharper, a hard edge forming in my chest. Linda had wanted me desperate, and she had succeeded, but she had miscalculated. Desperation is not the end. Desperation is the spark that ignites resolve. Her words still echoed in my mind. In the end, we always win. As the stars blinked cold above the silent ranch, I whispered back into the night. Not this time. Sleep did not come easily after that storm. I lay awake listening to the quiet drip of water falling from the eaves. Each drop was a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. In that silence, my mind began to turn. I thought of the ditch of the water, the way it moved without asking permission. And then I thought of Linda and her board, who believed they could command the flow of nature with signatures and stamps. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, an idea took root. The next morning, I drove to the county office again. This time, I asked for records older than the neighborhood itself. The clerk handed me dusty folders and rolled maps. I spread them across a long wooden table and studied the lines inked decades before. My heart quickened as I traced the path of the water system. The ditch was not just mine. It was tied into the original city drainage plan. It carried overflow down into a basin that fed into the municipal supply. My ranch had been designed as part of the larger system long before the HOA ever existed. I followed the lines further, and then I saw it. The same line that fed my ditch also connected to the irrigation system that watered the neighborhood greenbelts and even supplied the HOA's own office building. My lips curled into a slow grin. Linda had declared war on the ditch without realizing her empire was built on the very same water. For days I worked in secret. I copied maps and photographed every page. I visited the water department and asked careful questions pretending curiosity rather than strategy. Piece by piece, I built a file thicker than any binder Linda could wave away. I also reached out quietly to neighbors who had once whispered support. I showed them proof. Their eyes widened as they realized the HOA had been threatening me over something they themselves depended on. But still I kept my plan close. Linda was clever. She thrived on crushing resistance before it could bloom. If she sensed what I was preparing, she would strike first. So I let her believe I was broken. I allowed her letters to pile high on my desk. I nodded politely when she sneered at me in passing. I gave her the show she wanted. A man cornered and defeated. Inside, though, my resolve sharpened. I studied the main valve where the water line branched. It sat hidden beneath a rusted cover near the edge of my property. Few even knew it existed. With a single twist of metal, that valve could silence every sprinkler, every fountain, every carefully manicured strip of lawn that Linda paraded as proof of her authority. The irony filled me with a dark satisfaction. Then came the final notice, delivered by hand with Linda's signature, scrawled across the bottom in bold ink. It declared that foreclosure proceedings would begin within 30 days if I did not comply. She left it on my gate, post with a smirk visible from the road. To her, this was a final nail. To me, it was the signal. The time for quiet endurance had ended. I waited until the day of the neighborhood festival. The HOA had spent weeks preparing for it. Banners hung across the streets. Tables lined with catered food. Families gathered in the park, while sprinklers sprayed arcs of water across the perfect grass. Linda stood at the center glowing in praise as she welcomed guests. Her voice rang with authority as though she were mayor of her own tiny kingdom. I slipped away unnoticed. The sky was bright, the air buzzing with chatter. My boots crunched gravel as I walked to the hidden valve. I crouched low, lifted the cover, and placed my hand on the cool metal wheel. For a moment, I paused, listening to the faint rush of water beneath. Then I turned it, slowly, firmly, until the wheel would turn no more. The sound faded into silence. Back at the festival, laughter turned to confusion. The sprinkler sputtered and died mid-spray. The fountain at the entrance choked and stopped. Murmurs rose through the crowd as children pointed at the drying grass. Linda frowned, tapped her phone, barked orders at volunteers. Panic edged her polished tone. She had no idea what had happened. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the first cracks spread through her perfect facade. For the first time, I felt control shift beneath my feet. It was not victory yet, but it was the beginning. Chaos swept through the festival like wildfire. The laughter that once rang across the park twisted into confusion, then anger. Sprinklers stood dead, leaving the grass to brown under the glaring sun. The fountain at the entry lay silent, its basin empty of life. Vendors shouted as their coolers began to warm without the promised supply of water. Children cried as their games were cut short. And at the center of it all stood Linda, her flawless posture trembling with cracks she could not hide. She barked orders at her board members, demanding answers. They scrambled phones pressed to ears, faces flushed with panic. Nothing worked. Water trucks could not arrive in time. Plumbers shook their heads. The problem was deeper than any quick fix. Linda's polished voice rose sharper each moment, but the people no longer listened with reverence. They watched with suspicion and irritation as their carefully paid dues seemed wasted. I walked into the park steady and silent. Neighbors turned to look at me, some with recognition, some with curiosity. Linda's eyes found mine, and in them I saw the flicker of fear masked by rage. She strode toward me, heels striking the ground like gunshots. "You," she hissed loud enough for the crowd to hear. "What did you do?" I let the silence stretch before answering. Then I held up a folder thick with documents, photographs, and maps. My voice carried across the crowd. This is what I did. I found the truth. The ditch you tried to erase is not just my property. It is part of the city's drainage system. It protects not only my ranch, but this neighborhood. And the water you enjoy, the sprinklers you boast about, even the supply that runs your office flows from the same line that feeds my land. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People leaned closer, whispering to one another. A man in the back shouted that he wanted to see the proof. I handed copies to a few brave neighbors, and their eyes widened as they read. The truth spread like sparks in dry grass. Linda tried to snatch the folder from me, but I pulled it back. I spoke again, my tone calm yet cutting. You fined me for protecting my land. You threatened to take everything I own. But you never bothered to learn that your entire empire rests on the very ditch you called unsightly. Without it, your festival, your lawns, your prestige mean nothing. You were ready to destroy me while standing on ground you did not understand. Her face flushed deep red. She opened her mouth to retort, but the crowd had already shifted. Voices rose not in laughter, but in anger now directed at her. Questions flew like arrows. Why had she targeted me? Why had she lied? Why had she spent their money chasing a vendetta when the evidence was clear? Linda stammered. She raised her hands to quiet them, but the people would not listen. Phones recorded every moment. Someone streamed it live. Her authority crumbled in real time, and she knew it. Her perfect mask cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. I did not gloat, though the urge pulled at me. I simply turned and pointed toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered faint but sure. My voice dropped low but carried. Water always finds its way, and so does justice. The silence that followed struck harder than any cheer. Neighbors stared at Linda, their trust shattered. Board members exchanged nervous glances, no longer eager to defend her. One by one, they stepped back, leaving her exposed in the center of the crowd. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Within days, the board voted her out. Complaints flooded the city office, backed by my file of evidence. Fines were erased. Threats dissolved. My ditch was declared legally protected and beyond the reach of any HOA whim. On the ranch, peace returned. The ditch carried water as it always had, steady and strong. My cattle grazed without fear of rising floods. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved as they passed, offering nods of respect. Some even stopped to thank me for standing up when they could not. As for Linda, she vanished from her position, stripped of her power. Rumors swirled of her moving away, her pride shattered, her legacy ruined. Every now and then I imagine her watching clips of that festival, replayed, online mocked, and shared across feeds. The woman who once declared in the end, "We always win," now carried the face of defeat. I stood again by the ditch one evening, watching the current slip past stones glistening in twilight. I thought of the struggle, the fear, the anger, and finally the triumph. This land had tested me. Linda had tested me. But in the end, both had given me strength. I smiled to myself and whispered to the flowing water. They thought they could silence you. They thought they could silence me. But water always flows back where it belongs.